What if doing the right thing makes you the villain, and calling the cops on your neighbor exposes more about your own illusions than their truth? You want a neat moral. But tell me, what if the neat moral is the first lie we tell ourselves when the bass starts thumping to the drywall and the sky blushes with the pink of a dying sun, and you see, across your hedges, a woman named Karen erecting speakers like monuments to a private kingdom that isn't private anymore? I stood at my kitchen window, coffee cold, watching the illusion of suburban peace loosen, it seems, and I could already feel the word truth harden in my throat, like a pebble I might choke on if I didn't decide what kind of neighbor I wanted to be. Nietzsche once split the world in two with a glance. Apollonian order against Dionysian frenzy. And if you had been there with me, you could have seen those twin gods arguing on our property line. The string of light bulbs or crews stapled up against the dim geometry of my blinds. The invitation was never mailed to me, but arrived anyway in the form of cars, glitter, and unfamiliar laughter, like a tide rolling in without a moon to answer to. On screen, if this were a film, the word illusion would flicker at the edge of the frame, because I wanted to believe this was only a birthday, a one-off, a misunderstanding, a neighborly blip that wouldn't ask me for a side. But truth, that stern accountant, kept tapping its ledger, reminding me of how many times I had ignored small trespasses. The late-night drills, the shriek of pallets dropped on concrete, the endless parade of strangers who treated our cul-de-sac like a pier. Hannah Arendt warned that normality can dress cruelty in a cardigan, that ordinary people outsource responsibility to the music of the crowd, and I could feel the banality of it all settling on the neat lawns like golden dust. I told myself I would just watch, gather facts the way a surveyor threads a bright string across a contested field, because judgment without measurement is just another party trick. The first van arrived with boxes of plastic cups and a tub of ice heavy as guilt, and I watched two teenagers carry it like pallbearers for a quiet that had already died. Karen waved at me with the confidence of a queen who believes a crown is invisible, a smile stretched taut with permission that no one had granted. You know that tremor you feel when a boundary is tested, that almost erotic thrill of the line being crossed, not by you but for you, so you can pretend you were merely a witness while your pulse betrays your interest? I felt it, and I hated it, and I loved it, and I hated that I loved it. She moved to the backyard like a conductor, thin wrists cutting the air, redirecting cables, pointing to the deck that would become a stage, a platform where names could be shouted louder than they had ever been written. Someone hung a banner that said, "Tonight we don't apologize," and I wonder whether apologies are simply the receipts of conscience, kept but never audited. A neighbor from 2 doors down, the one with the immaculate azaleas, walked past my window with a smile and a shrug that translated to "what can you do," which is the shortest sermon on fatalism I have ever heard. The street began to pulse. Ride shares disgorging bodies, the white-blue flash of phones held aloft like talismans, a moving constellation of faces searching for a center of gravity that wouldn't hold. I breathed with the house, listening to its walls expand and contract like lungs that were not sure whether to sing or scream. If Foucault is right that power is everywhere and nowhere, then power that night was a bass line, a whisper that said, "Stay, don't be a narc, be cool, be modern, be merciful," and I confess that part of me craved the absolution that comes with silence. But there's another power that lives in every door lock and deed and easement, a civil script that says we're not the first to draw these lines. And when I look at the fence between our lots, at the screws I had tightened with my father's old driver, I remembered that maintenance is a kind of oath. Karen, in her sequin jacket, announced something to the gathering. Some raffle, some dare, some promise of a night that would cancel tomorrow, and the crowd responded like surf colliding with rocks, and for a moment I felt my body lean toward them as if pulled by weather. Ask yourself, if you had been there, would you have smiled and said it's just one night, or would you have heard, as I did, the prelude to a test that doesn't end at midnight? I texted a friend who knows my angers and my attempt at wisdom, and he wrote back, "Breathe, then ask what outcome you can live with," which sounds simple until you're the one living with it. On screen, cut to the word truth, stark white on black, then back to a slow pan across the driveway where beer bottles began to line up like obedient soldiers awaiting orders. The scent of weed braided with perfume and gasoline, a liturgy of modern hedonism that wouldn't survive the light of any doctrine but flourish here, at the edge of my patience. A drone lifted from someone's trunk and took to the air, its tiny rotors humming like an insect sent to harvest images, which is to say, to convert life into proof. I thought of Hobbes and his Leviathan, the cold bargain that keeps strangers from eating one another, and I wondered if the state had any place at a backyard communion of 300, if the social contract can be suspended by the sheer volume of a speaker stack. By then, cars choked the cul-de-sac, tires nudged my curb, and a pair of heels clicked on my walkway as if my path were a runway rented by the hour. I opened my door, not to invite but to witness, and the night rushed in with the smell of warm asphalt and sweet liquor and the metallic edge of risk. Someone asked me where the bathroom was, and when I said not here, they pointed at Karen's house and smiled, as if I were a glitch in their map, as if home were a public amenity. She saw the exchange and laughed like we were co-conspirators, like boundaries were jokes, and I was the best audience. I didn't laugh, but I didn't protest either. In that pause, I felt the seductive gravity of complicity wrapping itself around my ankles like surf, warm and deceitful. I could hear my father's voice, "Fix what you can fix, let the rest pass." And I could hear my mother's, "Dignity is not polite, it is precise," and their duet made a metronome in my ribs. Maybe you think I'm dramatizing a party, but the point is never the party. The point is what we permit when we want to be seen as tolerant, and how tolerance mutates into surrender when it's starved of boundaries. A bottle shattered somewhere, a small starburst in the dark, and a cheer rose like a wedding vow to chaos. I imagine the morning after, the trash, the oil stains, the apology would come half laughing, half accusing you're not fun, and I measured the cost of being unfun against the cost of being unfree. The night was becoming a thesis, and my house, my skin, my conscience were the seminar. On screen again, illusion. Then a quick cut to my hand, hovering over my phone. The lock screen reflected my face like a lake that asks whether it will accept a stone. I told myself I would wait until 10, then 11, then until the first siren, wherever it came from, because deferral is the most respectable mask cowardice owns. Karen climbed the fence to make a toast, gold light catching her hair, and I understood that charisma can be a solvent that dissolves other people's plans. So I began counting the cars, the strangers, the decibels, the excuses, because counting is how you teach your fear to speak in numbers, and numbers, unlike vibes, can stand up in the core of your own soul. Do you know the precise way of decision before you lift it? Or do you only learn its mass by the ache it leaves in your arm? Because as the head count swelled and the cul-de-sac became a tide pool of strangers shimmering under porch lights, I realized that neutrality is not a middle ground but a slope, and I was already slipping. On screen, the word silence fades and then dissolves into a close-up of my thumb hovering over the phone icon, because the interface is a shrine to options that all feel like confessions. I stepped outside with performative calm of a man pretending to retrieve his mail, and the air bristled with heat from bodies, base, and the friction of lives pressed too close to one another's borders, and I thought, isn't this what we purchase our mortgages to avoid? The riddle of proximity without intimacy? A teenage boy, eyes glassy with either alcohol or the need to be seen, sat on my curb and asked me if I vibed with the playlist, and I heard the dissonance in my own mouth when I told him, not so much, because language ages faster than beliefs, and my beliefs were aging fast. Karen stood at her threshold like a lighthouse keeper, hand cupped over her brow as if the night were a sea that answered to her signals, and when she caught my eye she smiled with a geniality that would have charmed me at a farmer's market and frightened me at a revolt. I walked to the fence line and waited like petitioner at a booth, and when she came close I saw the glitter on her jacket and the exhaustion in her pupils, and both told a story about power trying to solidify itself for one more night. She said it's community, right? We deserve one night where we're not apologizing to the invisible rules, and I felt my throat tighten around the word deserve. Have you noticed how often deserve arrives as a clean word to launder a dirty desire, and how the crowd, sensing absolution, will chant it until it sounds like truth? I told her there were already cars blocking driveways and a toddler next door who had started screaming from the sound, and she said, I get it. I really do, and I'll make an announcement, but please, no cops. Not tonight. Cops make everything worse. And for a second I switched lenses in my head and looked at the night through the history that animates her plea. What is the state if not an instrument we take out of its case when our personal music fails? And what is police if not a monopoly on force wrapped in training and paperwork and fear? And do I want that melody played under the score of our street? On screen, the word truth blinks, then cuts to a slow pushing on a child's bedroom window where a nightlight glows like a votive, because every argument about right should pan across the faces of those who can't argue back. A man I barely knew from 3 houses down, Miguel, whose kindness is a steady climate, came to stand beside me and said, "The older woman on the corner, she wears oxygen at night. She can't sleep through this," and I could hear the shape of a threshold assembling itself in my ribs like scaffolding. I asked Karen how many people were invited, and she laughed in a way that wasn't unkind but wasn't accountable, and she said, "It's a vibe. People bring people. Community builds itself." And I thought of termites doing the same with a house whose owner believes in laissez-faire. The dichotomy became brutal in its simplicity. Let the party colonize the night and be the cool neighbor who writes poems about tolerance, or intervene and be the villain in a story where morality is measured in likes and nostalgia for the minor rebellions of youth. And which role would you play if the camera were on you? A bottle flew. No malice. Just a dumb parabola of joy, and shattered near the storm drain, and a cheer rose, and I saw tiny shards glint in the streetlight like stars trapped in asphalt, and I knew someone would step wrong, maybe bleed, maybe sue, maybe forgive, maybe forget, but the ledger would keep a quiet, permanent record. A car rolled up slow with the driver squinting too hard and music pulsing inside like a second heart. He drifted too close to a girl's ankle, and the crowd swarmed with that sudden, eerie efficiency that can either protect or destroy. I felt my stomach nod into a prayer I don't believe in. I stepped forward to say something like, "Hey, move the car. Watch your space. Be better than this." And the driver complied with the day's courtesy of a sleepwalker. And Karen grabbed the mic and said, "Keep the driveway clear. Respect the neighbors. We're guests of the block." And for a moment her voice cooled the temperature by a single meaningful degree. Kierkegaard would call it dread, the dizziness of freedom when you could choose any path, and every path feels like a failure. And I could feel the vertigo in my knees, as if my bones were turning into questions. Miguel said, "What if we asked her to move the subwoofer away from the corner house? At least that." And the decency of that small ass felt like a rope tossed over a cliff. We walked with Karen to the deck and negotiated the feat, and inches of noise like diplomats of air, and the bass dialed down, and cheers turned from a roar into conversation. For 5 minutes, I believed in the treaty. For 5 minutes, the illusion of self-governance dressed itself in good intentions and stood like a statue that won't crumble. For 5 minutes, truth watched on the fence and waited for the next test like a proctor with a clock. The next test arrived as fireworks, cheap, illegal, sentimental, fizzing up from somewhere deep in the crowd, sparks kissing shingle and branch, and people laughed because spectacle purchases are feared discount, and I heard myself say, enough. When did enough stop being a word adults were allowed to use without an apology appended? And when did boundaries require branding campaigns to be acceptable? I took 2 steps into the yard, not mine, and felt 300 eyes without names flicker over me, not hostile, not friendly, just a weather pattern that could change without warning, and I asked the kid with the lighter to stop, and he shrugged with the impunity of youth, then did stop, because sometimes the first no is a spell that reminds the room it's being watched. But the fireworks were only the heralds. The real heat came from inside the house where, I would later learn, a bedroom had been converted into a VIP lounge, which is a euphemism for everywhere you don't want strangers to be near your toothpaste and your secrets. The line for the bathroom spilled into the yard like a river that forgot its banks, and the grass began wearing deep, muddy scars. On screen, cut to my shoes, the camera low, capturing the slow sinking into earth, then a hard cut to the security light blinking on and off, as if even the sensors were overwhelmed by the traffic of the night. A woman in a satin dress asked me if I was a neighbor who's cool with this, and I felt the assassin's blade of that compliment, because it's not kindness but an invitation to abdicate. I told her I was a neighbor who wanted everyone to get home safe in my block to still be livable in the morning, and she said, "Fair," and moved on, and I admired how fairness sometimes functions as a form of truce that keeps no one entirely happy. The HOA president, an invisible force until now, texted a group chat I had muted months ago, saying, "We're documenting. We're advising compliance. We're not calling the police yet." And I thought about Zuboff and the way documentation is a new prayer. We collect evidence as if the spreadsheet could save us. Do you ever measure your bravery by the screenshots you keep? And do you ever confuse keeping records with taking responsibility? Levinas wrote about the face of the other and the infinite demand it makes, and I tried to meet faces, not screens. So I wouldn't forget that Karen was not a caricature, but a person with a mother and perhaps a ledger of harms police inflicted on her people. And I tried to hold both truths in one trembling hand. A glass broke again, nearer, and I turned to help. And in the small act of picking up shard with a rag, I realized that intervention is not only a call, but choreography of tiny resistances. A word, a look, a hand on a shoulder, the gentle pressure of boundary that asks to be felt before it is enforced. But the choreography faltered when a man climbed onto the hood of my neighbor's car to take a video with a better angle. Illusion flashes on screen, then truth. And when I told him to get down, he laughed and asked me if I own a moon too. I said, I own my patience and you're leasing it, and it's due, and he laughed again, but he got down. The music spiked in volume again. The treaty dissolved, not maliciously, just as entropy does its work. And I understood that self-governance requires more than a charismatic host and a neighbor's endurance. It requires norms thick enough to resist adrenaline. The older woman on the corner, pale behind her window, lifted her hands in a gesture that looked like surrender but might have been prayer, and I felt a cold sting of shame that we were letting her night be colonized by a narrative she did not write. A police cruiser idled 2 blocks away, indifferent or tactical, I couldn't tell, and a rumor ran to the crowd that someone had already called, and immediately the temperature rose again because fear the state can turn a party into a barricade, and I tasted metal in my mouth. What is a neighborhood if not a pact to solve problems with words before sirens? And what happens when the words fail or refuse to be spoken because they're unfashionable? Miguel said, we need a line. We need to say if X happens, we call. And I said, yes, a rubric for courage. And we wrote one in our heads like an emergency poem. If the fireworks return, if the car moves without clarity, if anyone falls and stays down, if the bass finds the oxygen tube's rhythm and crushes it. On screen, a stark intertitle, thresholds, then a montage of small moments, laughter, a dog barking itself hoarse, shoes slipping in wet grass, a hand steadying a stranger, a pile of red cups like a modern ruin, as if the edit itself were trying to decide if beauty justifies harm. I told Karen, one last time, we are close to calling, and she said, I hear you, I'm on it, and I believed her, and maybe that belief was either grace or gullibility, and maybe the difference between those two is measured by whether night ends without an ambulance. A neighbor I barely liked surprised me by pressing a bottle of water into my hand, and I drank like a man who had forgotten hydration was a thing the living do. And I remembered that communities are seldom composed of friends, but often knitted by obligations and the soft mercy of small utilities. Then the drone came back, lower now, intrusive and efficient, and hovered over the older woman's bedroom window, as if curiosity were a right. I swatted the air with my hand because some gestures, however futile, remind you that your body still believes in borders. The drone pivoted and fled, which felt like an omen or a punchline, I couldn't tell. The bathroom line turned into an argument. The argument turned into shoves, and the shoves softened back into laughter, because embarrassment is a natural de-escalation tool. But a girl sat down suddenly on the grass and did not get up right away, and for a few seconds time held its breath. She rose, eventually wobbly and pale, and I heard myself say out loud, we are one event away. And Miguel nodded like an executioner receiving the warrant. The phone in my hand had the weight of a small stone meant for a very old ritual, and I wonder if my ancestors had their own version of this. Some town crier or church bell, some agreed-upon sound that breaks the social trance and summons Leviathan, and whether they, too, hated themselves even as they pulled the rope. I looked again at Karen, and in her face I saw not malice but momentum, the runaway machine of a promise she couldn't retract without becoming the villain in her own story. And I remembered the dignity in admitting a thing has gone too far, and I wondered who had taught her that dignity would cost her more than applause. On screen, truth in bold. Then a slow dolly in on my phone where 9 and 1 become a triptych of consequence. Off screen, the bass thumps like a mechanical heart. I told myself one more pass, one more announcement, one more chance to let the night save itself. And I found in that bargain the precise architecture of procrastination disguised as mercy. And I forgave myself because I want to live among forgivers, not scorekeepers. But mercy without spine rots. And I felt the first vertebrae resolve harden, not into anger, but into a kind of cold clarity. And I thought, if the next breach occurs, I call, and I will own the call the way a surgeon owns the incision. Not with joy, but with a reverence for what else might die if I don't. The crowd swelled again. The treaty forgot itself. The neighbors' windows became eyes, and the cul-de-sac became a courtroom without a judge. And I knew then that the ethics of intervention aren't studied in books at night. So much is practiced on sidewalks under sodium lamps. This is a part where a narrative wants a clean line, a single shove that justifies a siren, but reality, stubborn and perverse, offers only aggregations of small harms and soft excuses. And then suddenly, a breakpoint that feels both obvious and cruel. I stood there, breathing like a man learning to swim at the depth line, and I asked you, yes, you, what would you have me do when community asks for infinite patience, and the vulnerable ask for sleep, and the host asks for mercy, and the law asks for a phone call, and my conscience asks not to be performed but to be precise? The breakpoint did not arrive as a single crack, but as a web of hairline fractures that suddenly realized they belonged to the same shattering. On screen, the word thresholds pulses like a heartbeat, then cuts to the older woman's window where the nightlight trembles in the glass, as if it knows the script better than we do. A new car nosing against the flow, its bumper kissing my mailbox like a careless confession, and the driver climbed out already filming. Because why live an event when you can outsource your memory to a lens? Karen's mic squealed with feedback, a metallic shriek that felt like truth slipping on linoleum, and for a second even exuberant forgot their lines. Then the fireworks returned with petty bravado. Fireflies turned feral, sizzling up into a low-hanging branch where tinder-dry leaves received them like gossip. I felt time thread a needle through my sternum, slow and precise, and I heard my own voice say no, not asked as a question but offered as a boundary that remembered how to stand. The kid with the lighter smirked, a reflex more than malice, and he pointed higher as if gravity were a negotiable contract, and a small ember drifted sideways toward the corner porch where plastic hung like drapery. Miguel saw it too and moved before I did, knocking the ember to the walkway with a shoe, grinding it into a harmless smear while the crowd laughed at a near miss they would forget by morning. My hands were shaking with adrenaline's counterfeit wisdom, that bright lie that says movement is morality, and I forced myself to count to 10 because rituals are how we domesticate panic. On screen, illusion fades and over a slow pan of smiling faces. Then truth hard cuts to the oxygen concentrator's green light, blinking behind a curtain like a metronome no one hears but me. A shove turned into a stumble turned into a fall, a woman dropping to her knees on the slick grass, her wrist catching wrong with a sound that every parent recognizes as the prelude to a long night in urgent care. She tried to stand, failed, tried again, succeeded, laughed bravely because bravery is cheaper than shame, and the crowd rewarded her with applause that sounded to me like a verdict deferred. Karen called for space and respect and the better angels of our cul-de-sac, and I believed, again, for the length of a breath, that the room could regulate itself without teeth. But then a driver reversed without looking, an SUV rolling blind into a cluster of ankles, and only luck intervened as hands slapped metal and mouths opened into a collective shout that startled the driver back into gear. Tell me, at what point does prudence become complicity? And at what point does intervention become performance for the mirror of your own conscience? And how do you tell one from the other when the night refuses to label its scenes? I looked at my phone and saw my reflection warped by the glass, a face I sometimes respect and sometimes suspect, and in that distortion I heard my mother again. Dignity is not polite, it is precise. Precision here meant numbers and thresholds and the promised rubric. And the rubric had been met in quadruple, and avoidance was now a synonym for abdication. I stepped away from the driveway, away from the performance of deliberation, and into the cooler shadow of my porch where decisions are made because there is nowhere else to store them. On screen, the words call now appear in white over black, then dissolve into the blue-green glow of a phone interface that every adult recognizes as both a tool and a confession. I dialed, and the ring sounded like a rope tugging a bell in some older century with a town gathered not to judge but to coordinate, and I wondered whether we had unlearned that art. The dispatcher's voice was calm in the way mountain lakes are calm, deep in practice, and free of surprise, and I felt small and grateful and ashamed all at once. I said my name and my address in the shape of night. I said there were 300 plus. I said fireworks. I said near collision. I said vulnerable neighbor. I said host is trying but is beyond her. And my words felt like bricks placed carefully on a scale that had been tilted for hours. She asked me whether anyone was hurt, whether there were weapons, whether there was active danger, and I answered no. Not yet. Yes. Potentially yes in the aggregate, which is not a field her form accepts. How do you report a risk that blooms like ink and water, everywhere and nowhere? And how do you quantify a future harm that has not yet chosen its victim? She said units are on the way, and I felt the air change as if a weather front had crossed the street, invisible but decisive. I hung up and stood for a moment in the vestibule between silence and siren, and I tested the weight of what I had done by lifting it with my breath. On screen, truth appears again, then the camera tracks a Karen at the mic as if the lens itself were choosing sides. I walked to her, because even after the call I owed her the courtesy of a face-to-face reality, and I told her plainly that I had summoned the state, and the sentence tasted like metal and rain. Her eyes did a quick calculus. Fear, anger, leadership, optics, and for a heartbeat I saw the human before the host, a woman without a script. She said, "You didn't have to," and I said I didn't want to, and both statements were true, and neither absolved the other. She asked me for time, 10 minutes, 15, and I said the units are already moving and time, tonight, belongs to a different clock. The crowd felt it before anyone said it. That subterranean ripple when a rumor arrives with its own gravity, and heads lifted like animals scenting rain. A chant began, not hostile, not yet, just a murmur rehearsing the muscle memory of defiance, and I saw phones tilt from party mode to documentary mode, because narrative pivots are content. Miguel touched my shoulder, not to comfort but to anchor, and he said, "We did what we said we'd do." And I believe him, not because belief was easy, but because the alternative was to drown in my own second-guessing. On screen, illusion overlays the scene with a faint, shimmering haze. The fantasy that this could still be managed with charisma and decibels. Then truth cuts through like a cold blade, revealing trash, exhaustion, frayed edges, and the old woman's sleepless silhouette. Karen raised her hand for quiet and got it. And in the hush, she asked for calm, for dispersal, for a graceful exit, and for a split second I want to take the call back like a letter unsent. But then a young man on the steps shouted that no one leaves, that the cops don't get to shut down joy, and joy, intoxicated by the sound of its own name, stood up and flexed. I told myself again that calling is not a cruelty but a boundary with teeth, and that grown neighborhoods sometimes need the blunt instrument of the state when voluntary norms collapse under the weight of adrenaline. If that sounds like capitulation to you, ask yourself which illusions you protect when you sneer at enforcement, and whether you would say the same if your mother needed sleep, if your mailbox had a bruise, if your lawn remembered footprints it never invited. The first siren floated in from a far avenue like a prophecy sung in a minor key, and every face turned toward the sound, and the night, at last, admitted it would have to choose what kind of story it wanted to be. The sirens didn't burst so much as bloom, petals of red and blue unfurling down the block, and the street inhaled sharply as if the air itself needed courage to hold what came next. And I wonder, as you watch with me, what you expected the Leviathan to look like when it finally rolled out of the deep. The first cruiser nosed in without theatrics, lights cutting the dusk into slices of certainty. And the officer stepped out with that rehearsed slowness that says we've seen this before and we prefer the script to the improvisation. And the crowd did what crowds do when authority arrives. Some stiffen like statues posed for defiance, some soften into relief like a muscle unclenching, and most turn their faces into cameras because witnesses have been replaced by angles. On screen, the word illusion floats over the party like fog. Then truth snaps in with a clean cut to a clipboard, a radio crackle, a measured voice. One officer scanned the sea of bodies with the narrow-eyed patience of a farmer assessing weather, while the other spoke into a shoulder mic that made his forearm twitch with small electric responsibility, and I felt the street's temperature drop by a degree, not cold, but less fevered, as if the night had been told that bedtime exists, and you could sense the mixed prayers rising. Let them leave us alone. Let them restore order. Let them be gentle. Let them be strong. Weber whispers through the edit that the state claims a monopoly on legitimate violence, and tonight legitimacy will be tested by the eyes of 300 strangers who do not agree on what violence means. An officer raised 2 fingers for quiet and said, "This is a noise complaint and a public safety hazard. We are asking you to begin dispersing in an orderly manner," and the word asking carried the weight of a loaded future. Karen, amplified by her own system by the story's gravitational pull, stepped forward with palms up, a gesture that can read a surrender or sales pitch, and she said, "This is a private event. It's community. It's peaceful. We're winding down. Give me time. And her voice had the tensile strength of a bridge that looks new, but has an old river beneath it. What would you have me tell her in that moment when her dignity and her plan collided with a badge and a policy manual? The first officer kept his tone level. Ma'am, we've received multiple calls. Fireworks have been reported. Vehicles are obstructing driveways. We need the music off and the property clear to residents and invited guests only. And you can feel the line being drawn not by ideology but by logistics, which is where most revolutions die and most neighborhoods live. On screen, a lower third title flickers. Boundaries. Someone booed, not with venom but with disappointment, which can be more dangerous because it recruits sympathy, and a chant tried to gather itself and failed because chants require focus, and this crowd was already fraying. I stood close enough to see the calculus happen across Karen's face. This is my house. These are my people. This is my night. This is the state. And I ache for her because leadership in the moment of collapse is a crucible that leaves no one unburned. Miguel moved like a current toward a cluster of kids by the SUV, ushering them out of the driveway's mouth before police made a directive, and I had a brief, irrational fantasy that we could still end this as neighbors do, with hands, with words, with quiet dignity of admitting fatigue. But inevitability had found its path, as it always does, and the second cruiser arrived with a supervisor whose posture said we have 15 minutes to turn this from a festival into a sidewalk, and the countdown began on clocks none of us could see. Baldwin once wrote that innocence is the mass power wears to absolve itself, and I felt my own innocence tug at my sleeve, eager to declare that I wanted safety, not trouble, that I wanted sleep, not a spectacle, and I told it to sit down and watch, because we are implicated whether we sing or whisper on screen. Illusion in pale letters over faces smiling for their live stream. Truth in stark white over the older woman's window where the nightlight flickers under the weight of sirens threading. The glass. The officers, in measured cadence, began directing cars to move, people to step off the curb, music to cut to zero, and the subwoofer's coil sighed as if relieved to stop being a heart for so many bodies, and then the friction that every script predicted arrived in the smallest, pettiest way. A guest who refused to move his car because he'd just found this spot. A protest shaped like convenience. A rebellion with the ambition of a parking ticket. And when the officer reached for the door handle, the kid slapped his hand away. Not hard, not strategic. Just a reflex of someone who has never met consequences without a buffer. The officer's eyes hardened by a single notch, the way steel tempers under a flame that was already lit, and hands that had been gesturing open-palmed now framed the space with more definitive angles. And the crowd murmured and phones rose, and we were all co-authors in narrative we pretended to only read. Karen, seeing the pivot, stepped in between like a hinge trying to hold two doors, and she said, "I've got this, I've got him, please, let me manage." And for a second it worked. The kid sulked but reversed. The wheels creaked, the path opened like a wound learning to close. And yet momentum is a jealous god, and the next breach arrived, a woman arguing inches from an officer's face, breath hot with vodka and ideology, insisting on rights she had Googled and misremembered, and when he asked her to step back, she leaned in instead, and the crowd hissed as if prodding a snake to test its range. Here is where philosophizing has to touch ground. Power exists not as an essay, but as a choreography of bodies in space, and de-escalation is not poetry but timing, and this night was running out of both. The supervisor gave the order with a nod too subtle for the cameras, but vivid to anyone who has ever seen a classroom go feral. Shut it down. The officers moved with that unnerving calm of people trained to absorb chaos and return rules, and the requests became commands, and the commands acquired a grammar of consequence. Karen, cornered by the arithmetic of the moment, raised her voice and told people to go home. For real. This is over. I love you. Thank you. Goodbye. And many listened because fatigue had climbed into their bones and gratitude was cheaper than citation. But some stayed, as some always do, stubborn on principle or inertia, and a guy on the porch shouted, "We have rights," and the porch agreed, and suddenly the steps were staged for the old drama. State versus self, order versus vibe, tomorrow versus now. On screen, the word truth advances across the frame like a tide, swallowing the glitter underfoot. I found myself whispering to you, though you weren't there, that this is the moment when myths either harden or melt, and which do you want to watch happen? Because there's no neutral camera when the light bars paint the asphalt with zebra stripes. A third cruiser slid in, not menacing, just efficient, and blocked the alley that had been an escape valve, and the security car from the mall's edge idled at the perimeter, as if even private authority wanted to bear witness while not being mistaken for the public kind. And then the gravitational center shifted to Karen herself, not because she courted it, but because it hunts hosts when crowds don't disperse, and an officer said, "Ma'am, we need you to cut the power and clear the property now." And she said, I'm trying, and her voice cracked on the last word like a thin line of ice over a pond. She moved to the breaker box with a set of keys that jingled like a chime announcing the end of service, and the deck went dark as if a curtain had dropped, and a strange silence fell, not peaceful, not hostile, just a silence of unamplified humans remembering their original volume. And then, from somewhere at the rear, a defiant speaker still pulsed, a robe channel fed by an extension cord's stubborn artery, and an officer stepped to unplug it, while a friend of Karen's grabbed his wrist and said, "Don't touch our stuff," and the two gestures collided like weather fronts. That was the first ripple of detention. The friend was gently but firmly moved, hands secured not roughly but definitely, and the crowd gasped because handcuffs, like funerals, make everything suddenly non-negotiable. Karen spun back toward the officers with a voice sharpened by helplessness and said, "That's my guess. That's my responsibility. Don't take him. Take me if you need to make a point." And the sentence hung there like a dare or a prayer. Do you believe in the nobility of sacrifice when it is born of pressure rather than principle? And does the universe care which made the difference? Or does it simply record who went and who stayed? The supervisor, reading the knot, stepped forward and told her to stand back, and Karen, in that tiny, fatal moment, did not. She hovered inside a radius that training defines as risk, and when the officer shifted to guide her away, she pulled, first back, then sideways, then square, a body saying no without language in the crowd. Hungry for a pivot, angry at the inevitable, roared like an ocean. Arrest is not a moral but procedure, and procedures, when viewed in close-up, look like cruelty even when they are restraint, and I watched with stomach full of gravel as Karen's hands were taken, turned, cuffed, as words were read, as she stared at a point beyond the nearest porch lamp like a person recalibrating to a gravity she did not consent to, on screen. Illusion smears into lens flare, then truth lands as a single word. Consequences. Someone shouted her name in the tone of a sibling, someone else in the tone of a fan, and I felt a flash of self-loathing because the story I had set in motion had found its headline, and the algorithms would not care about the paragraphs of context. The older woman in the corner window lowered her hands from prayer or surrender. I will never know which. And the night felt suddenly older than any of us. The officers, to their credit or their habit, did not grandstand. They moved with the care of professionals who understand that a camera can indict a gesture, and yet the sight of her, sequins dim under emergency light, walking in that peculiar, shortened gait that cuffs enforce, will live in my spine like a splinter that refuses to migrate. Was it necessary, you ask, and I ask, too, because necessity is a greenhouse where we grow the herbs that season our guilt. Could they have sighted and released? Could she have yielded 5 seconds sooner? Could I have waited 15 minutes? Could we all have agreed that sleep matters and joy returns and dignity includes a word enough? Camus would shrug at the absurd geometry of it, and Fanon might remind me that policing isn't neutral in every story, and Arendt would warn against storytelling. That launders responsibility into fate. Karen glanced at me once, only once, and her eyes did not accuse so much as they tallied, and in that inventory I saw myself not as hero or villain, but as neighbor who pulled a bell rope when the roof began to smoke, and perhaps as all I am allowed to be. Miguel jaw clenched, stood like a lamppost throwing whatever light he could, and we both flinched when a bottle shattered somewhere far enough away to be symbolic, but close enough to be a threat. The dispersal, once the arrest had branded the night with its decisive stamp, finally accelerated. The spell had broken, and people remembered mortgages, jobs, early alarms, hangovers. The way sun exposes everything you wish remained rumor. Cars peeled away in staggered lines, the cul-de-sac uncoiling like a snake after a storm, and the officers began the slow work of paperwork, which is how states turn nights into records. I stood in the driveway, a minor character whose action had shifted the genre, and I talked to you in my head because I needed a witness who wasn't holding a phone, and I wanted to ask whether justice ever feels like relief or only like a chore done too late to count as pride. On screen, a final juxtaposition for this beat. Illusion in cursive over a montage of dance and glitter. Truth in plain font over a broom. a trash bag, a citation, a pair of tired neighbors exchanging a nod that is no. Emoji. The ambulance lights we saw earlier hover at the far edge and then faded, unnecessary, which felt like a humble victory in a ledger mixed outcomes. The older woman's window went dark at last, and that, too, I wrote down in the ledger of reasons, because not everything can be content. Some things must be sleep. If the camera lingers here, it should linger not on the cuffs, but on the quiet aftermath beginning to unfurl, a gate closing, a string of bulbs sagging, dew forming on a torn flyer, a fence line remembering its function. And if you're asking me whether I would do it again, I will answer in the next breath, because the next breath is where remorse and resolve wrestle, and the night, though ending, wants one more argument with the morning. Morning arrived like a verdict written in soft light, and the cul-de-sac looked hungover from its own bravado. I stepped outside with a trash bag and a broom, not to perform virtue, but to learn what responsibility feels like when the audience is left. On screen, if you were cutting this, the word truth would appear over a close-up of my hands lifting bottle caps in the gutter, while illusion would flicker atop the lone strand of bulbs, still pretending the night had rights. Sleep had sanded the edges of my anger, but not the outline of my choice, which sat in my chest like a book I hadn't finished but kept carrying. Neighbors emerged in pajamas and baseball caps, a quiet procession of ordinary clergy tending to the sacrament of repair. Miguel handed me gloves and a grin that knew better than to ask if I was okay. The older woman's curtains were open and she waved, an oxygen tube tapping her cheek like a metronome that had finally found a slower song. Is relief the same as justice? Or is it just a Sabbath granted to the nervous system, a loan we repay in doubt? I tell you this because the morning after is where philosophy must earn its keep, where Nietzsche's intoxications evaporate and Arendt's ledgers balance in compost bins and HOA emails. Karen's porch was quiet. The sequins of the previous night turned into confetti of sun on a damp railing, and the door bore a polite notice in the city, like a stamp in a passport you don't want. I wrote a note, plain, unassuming, without apologies or accusations, and slipped it into the frame, saying, I hope you're safe. I'm available to talk. We need to figure out how to live here together. Do you hear the arrogance in that, or the humility, or both braided into the tether we throw across a divide when we can't stand the silence? Phones began to chirp with the second wave. Not sirens, but opinions, a chorus of texts and DMs that sorted me into archetypes like a filing system for the soul. Snitch, hero, cop caller, adult, neighbor, narc, responsible, colonizer vibes. Words that try to trap me in a single gesture as if the night had not been a floodplain of contingencies. On screen, cut to a scroll of notifications with the caption illusion, then hard cut to my call log and the word truth. Because history looks like receipts when you bring it to the stadium of judgment. The HOA thread, reheated and noisy, announced a special meeting, and the subject line might as well have read Theology of Boundaries disguised as minutes and motions. Miguel proposed we do the simplest, hardest thing. Clean together first, talk later. So we cleaned, and the neighborhood slowly resembled itself, which is a modest miracle and a reminder that order is not delivered but maintained like a garden that resents neglect. When the last red cup was gone and the last shard had been coaxed from the asphalt with a piece of tape and patience, the silence that arrived did not accuse me anymore. It simply existed. At noon, I opened my laptop and saw the videos, dozens of angles bent into hundreds of truths, each caption sharpening or blurring me according to the needs of the poster's tribe. Here is a conceit of modern penance. We replay the tape and look for the frame that exonerates us, and the frame that damns us, and we pretend the montage is fairness. A stranger messaged to say that calling the cops risks lives, that I had escalated because I love control, and another stranger wrote that my restraint had endangered a child, that I had hesitated because I love approval. How do you audition for two opposing juries and accept that both will throw rotten fruit because neither is interested in your particular math? I brewed coffee like it was a ritual for absolution and read the city code like scripture, dull and precise, full of clauses that try to domesticate neighborliness when it fails itself. At 3, an officer called with a calm that tasted like cardboard, informing me that citations had been issued, that one arrest had been processed and released, that follow-up would be routed through community liaison channels. I asked whether there had been injuries, and he said no, which I wrote inside my ribs in small light. The liaison later suggested mediation, and the word felt both promising and theatrical, as if a stage were being set for the performance of reconciliation. On screen, the word repair appears over a slow dolly into the community center's beige multipurpose room, where Hope always has to sit on stackable chairs. Before mediation, I walked a corner and knocked, and the older woman's son answered with a tired kindness that carries its own authority. He said thank you without ceremony, and I said I'm sorry without theatrics, and we stood in the doorway like two men choosing not to be strangers. Isn't that what we wanted at the party? A feeling of not being strangers. And isn't it brutal that sometimes the path to that feeling is the opposite of a party? At the meeting, the HOA president performed his anxiety with bullet points, while the room performed its ambivalence with crossed arms, and I performed my resolve by speaking slowly enough to hear myself. I said I would call again under the same conditions. I would prefer a neighborhood where we never have to call, and I would work for that with my time and my money and my patience. Karen arrived late, eyes ringed not with mascara, but with the tax that inevitability levies, and the room rearranged itself along familiar fault lines that have nothing to do with fences and everything to do with biography. She spoke with a steadiness that made me ache, saying it was meant to be joyful, that the cops felt like a betrayal of her safety, that the arrest cut deeper than any fine, that she would not apologize for joy but would apologize for harm. When it was my turn again, I said I believe you about joy, and I believe me about harm, and the problem is that both beliefs grow like vines until they strangle the trellis we try to share. On screen, illusion and truth appear side by side for once, not fighting but overlapping like two transparencies that make a new image when you dare to line them up. We agreed imperfectly, provisionally, on limits with numbers, on quiet hours with teeth, on a contact chain that rings neighbors before badges, on training for de-escalation that doesn't leave courage unemployed. Outside afterward, I walked with Karen to the edge of our property line, and we stood there like diplomats on an invisible border. And she said, I don't forgive you yet. And I said, I don't forgive me yet either. And somehow that sounded like a beginning. If you ask me what responsibility feels like now, I will tell you it feels like holding a key you didn't want and deciding whether to open a gate or lock it, and knowing the hinge can be oiled by mercy without letting the fence rot. I promise you a climax at the end, but the last turn of the screw is quieter than you expect. Not a siren nor a gavel, but the sound of a pen scratching across a page as two people who are not heroes and not villains sign a compact they wrote with their own fallibility. And I have to ask you, before the credits roll, what kind of citizen do you become when the music stops and your breath is still loud in your ears? Because on screen, as a frame opens on our street a week later, the words, illusion and truth, finally share the same line without attempting to devour each other, and the camera drifts past the rebuilt fence, the modest gate, the surveyor's string, the corner window now dark at an ordinary hour, and the breaker box where the power knows its place. I met Karen on the sidewalk between our lots with no audience but the birds and the dog that doesn't understand property rights, and she handed me a key, not to her house, not to mine, just to the gate between, a gesture that, in other centuries, might have been called a covenant, and I took it with a respect that was not forgiveness and not absolution, but the humble agreement to try again. And if you think that's sentimental, ask yourself whether cynicism has ever patched a fence or made a norm. We sat on the curb like kids who'd stayed out too late, knees touching the same warm concrete. And we talked about the arithmetic of nights, how joy multiplies and risk compounds, how dignity discounts itself when crowds are hungry, and how the state is a tool we can neither deify nor despise without lying about the blood and the paperwork in equal measure. And I told her I will still call of our rubric triggers, and she told me she will still throw parties because life is short and her joy is not a crime. And the difference between those sentences is a hinge, not a wall. And hinges require oil, attention, respect, contingency plans, and the courage to say enough without using the other person's history as a weapon. On screen, a slow intertitle, practice, because the harshest truth of adulthood is that peace is not a feeling but a discipline, a choreography you rehearse while it's sunny so that your bones know the steps when the weather changes. And that's why we drew up a map with dull edges and sharp numbers, guest caps tied to capacity, not vibe, decibel limits that respect oxygen and sleep, kitchen TR routes that keep cars from grazing ankles, designated responders who are not cops but trained in, the secular sacrament of de-escalation, and a timer on the breaker like a Sabbath for the bass, because virtue unmeasured is vanity in disguise. And yes, We wrote a clause with teeth, a 911 threshold that neither flatters nor demonizes a leviathan, but names it as a last resort instrument reserved for smoke, not for the smell of burnt toast. And we signed it, and we texted it, and we taped it inside a cabinet like liturgy, and we told the block, not as PR, but as an invitation to share the burden before it becomes a burden again. And if this sounds bureaucratic, remember that rituals are what we build when we want freedom to outlive charisma. I need to tell you the most unsettling part, which is not the handcuffs, not the comment sections, not the HOA's theater, but the unmistakable sensation that I liked having authority for a moment, that tight, illicit focus that a decision grants. And I confess this because power is sweetest when it masquerades as responsibility. And if I do not interrogate my appetite, I will become the very agent of control I claim to fear. And that is the crack where authoritarianism breeds in the everyday heart. So I will say it plainly. Calling the cops is not virtue. It is a failure that sometimes prevents a worse failure, which means the moral work starts long before sirens, in the unnoticed labor of neighborliness. Learning names, trading numbers, showing up at 4 p.m. barbecues, so you're credible at 1 a.m., coaching teenagers to be less, enchanted by spectacle, budgeting for better lighting and shared resources, and rehearsing sentences that do not tremble when they carry the word no. On screen, cut to a sequence of hands, not clasped and combined but busy, repairing a latch that sticks, labeling extension cords, mapping exits, placing sand in a metal bucket where fireworks might try to clear themselves, and then in a hard cut, the word truth over a blank screen. Because truth is not performative. It is the absence of a 1,000 preventable performances. We also did the adult thing with the uncomfortable history, inviting a liaison to talk not about law and order as a parade of abstractions, but about the very real ways policing fails certain bodies and saves others, sometimes the same bodies on different Tuesdays. And we said out loud that we want fewer cops in our story because we want stronger norms, not because we want chaos. And that is the radical center I am recruiting you to consider. Build redundancy and compassion, and redundancy in procedure, so that force becomes rare by design, not by wishful thinking. And then I looked at Karen, at the streaks under her eyes that even good nights draw, and I said, I'm not sorry I called. I'm sorry it was necessary. And she said, I'm not sorry I threw a party. I'm sorry I didn't listen when the night started telling me the truth. And we both laughed that graveyard laugh you use when you're burying a version of yourself you don't want to meet again. And the dog sneezed as if to stipulate the mundane fact that life goes on, paperwork goes in folders, and grass grows back if you don't grind it down every weekend. I wanted to hold this thesis with me because it cuts, because it will not flatter whichever tribe drafts your captions. The opposite of a cop is not a vibe. The opposite of a cop is a neighbor who has done the work to be believed when they say stop. And if you have not done that work, your dislike of sirens is merely aesthetic. On screen, the word illusion glides over a montage of community as marketed. Then truth lands on the dull beauty of community as maintained. Shared calendars, keys exchanged without suspicion, disagreement that is frank but not fatal, and the quiet miracle of a street that goes to sleep. When it intends to, we scheduled a block drill. Not for disasters with names, but for the generic emergency of human exuberance untethered from foresight, because practice is the only antidote to panic that isn't a prayer, and I am asking you directly to write your rubric before you need it, to meet your neighbor before you judge her, to inventory your appetite for control before circumstances hand you a badge made of fear. And yes, I walked back to my porch that night and sat on the steps and said out loud the words I would put on screen in your edit: illusion, truth, boundary, mercy, consequence, repair, letting each one taste like metal and rain until it lost its glamour and regained its use. And the stillness that followed did not exonerate me. It employed me. People will ask, in the streaming commentary of your conscience, whether I am the villain or the reluctant adult, and I will answer that the category is irrelevant because grown neighborhoods are not myths. They are maintenance schedules with souls attached, and the soul work is more tedious than dramatic. It is sweeping before the party, not just after. It is learning your own tells when you are intoxicated by righteousness. It is letting the word enough be a compliment you give to a night that chose rest. So take this as a call to action delivered without drumroll. Draft your threshold with your block, laminate them. Review them quarterly like budgets and fire extinguishers. Teach your kids and your guess the choreography of arrival and exit. Keep a list of non-police numbers that carry real help. Mediators, elders, nurses, pastors, night shift sages. Pool money for a rideshare voucher that turns stubbornness into a ride home. Train 3 people in de-escalation, not because you are dangerous, but because you are human. And agree, with kindness and precision, that a single phone call is sometimes the least violent act available when everything else has already failed. And that you will meet afterward in daylight with brooms and coffee before you meet with opinions. On screen. In the last sequence, the camera moves low along the rebuilt fence, lingers on the key resting in a shallow ceramic dish by my door, glances up at the older woman's window now holding only sky, and settles on a surveyor's string removed and coiled in my hand like a line not erased but retired, and in white, unadorned letters one word: choose. Because here's a harsh truth I promise and save for. The end. You do not get be innocent in a neighborhood. You only get be useful. And usefulness is the courage to trade your favorite illusion for the truth your block can live with, even when that truth demands you carry a bell rope in one hand and a broom in the other. And I'm asking you, before your next night begins, before the base learns your walls, to decide which hand you will raise first, and to practice until it is no longer performance, but a reflex stitched into the ordinary fabric of your street, because the climax you crave is bolder in daylight. It is a moment 100 small preparations turn a crisis into a conversation, and a conversation into sleep, and sleep, my friend, is the most underrated revolution on any block that intends to see the morning.